Leo Koretz was a very successful stockbroker in Chicago. He had millionaires in that area in the 1900s when he was working come to him and trust him to invest their money wisely, and he did a great job with it. Nobody was displeased with putting their money into his hands. He always got a return on investment. He invested stocks very well. Well, one day he decided he was tired of working for millionaires all the time and wanted to be one himself. And so he took a chance on 5 million acres of land in Panama. Hadn't seen it, but it was a good deal, so he went ahead and bought it. A few people asked him about it, and he said, listen, I'm going to go away for 3 months. I'm going to check out the 5 million acres that I bought. I want to see what it is that I purchased and see whether it was a good purchase or not. And so for 3 months, he goes away. And when he comes back, Leo is wearing nicer suits. And when he comes back, he's got a bigger house. And he's got a nicer car. And a chauffeur for the nicer car. And his friends are surprised. Leo, what happened over the last few months? And he wouldn't tell them. He said, listen, I've fallen into some good favor. Things are going my way. I've just been lucky recently. Well, they kept bugging him about it. Why all this change? Where'd all this money come from? And finally at a party, he let his guard down a little bit and said, listen, I bought a bunch of land in Panama. And when we got there, we found that there were mahogany trees all over the place. And I've got people working around the clock. And my contact down there has people working around the clock, cutting them down, shipping them out. The boats can't even keep up with what we're producing. And then my contact down there, Mr. Arthur Gibson was his name, said that underneath the trees, as we're uprooting them, we found that there's oil in the land in Panama. And so, needless to say, I've had some pretty good fortune lately. Well, his investor friends naturally wanted to invest in the land. They wanted to give him money so that they could get more money off of all the oil and all the mahogany trees. And so he lets them invest. About 100 different people he lets invest in all this. In 1923, a few of those investors say, you know what? We want to go check out Panama for ourselves. We want to look at the land that we've invested in. And so they go, only to find that there aren't any mahogany trees. There's no oil derricks or anything. There's no factory that's for Leo Koretz, timber and oil. There's no Mr. Arthur Gibson. And nobody in Panama even knows who Leo is. And when they come back to Chicago, they find that Leo has run off to Nova Scotia. He cheated them. They go and find him, bring him back to Chicago. He's put on trial, and then he's later imprisoned. As it turns out, he made the whole thing up and tricked people into investing with him something that he didn't actually own, made up stories about all the stuff that was here, and just like any other scheme that goes this way, as more people invested, he paid off the first people and kept things going, and if nobody had checked it out, he might have been able to get away with it a lot longer. That 3 months that he went to spy out his land in Panama, he was actually just vacationing with his investors' money. He went up to New York, went over to New Orleans, just spent 3 months traveling. The new suits that he had, that was paid by the investors. The new car, the chauffeur, that was the investors. The big house, the investors. Mr. Arthur Gibson didn't even exist. It was all made up. All the papers that Mr. Arthur Gibson sent him about the trees and the oil, whole thing was faked. And he was imprisoned and found guilty for taking, in the 1920s, $1.7 million from 100 different investors. That just goes to show you what a lot of us know. Sometimes if something sounds too good to be true, it is. We've been talking about Israel through the book of Joshua and them coming to the entrance of the Promised Land. And we noted Deuteronomy 1, the first time Israel is there at the entrance to the Promised Land. And they have heard about the land flowing with milk and honey, that it's their promised land, that it belongs to them, and they get there and they go, all right, this is too good to be true. There are giant cities in the land. There are giant people in the land. There is no way that we're going to be able to inherit this. There's no way we're going to be able to take it over. And they became hopeless. You might remember what we talked about from Numbers. We seemed like grasshoppers in their eyes and in our eyes as well. They were hopeless people. It seemed too good to be true, and so they wandered the wilderness for 40 years. And then when we come into Joshua chapter 1, God tells Joshua, who then tells the people, be strong and courageous. And he makes two promises to them. I'm going to give you the land, and I'm going to give you victory over your enemies. Today, as we continue with this idea of how do we become filled with hope when we feel hopeless, I want us to look at the things that God has provided in our life. I want to start with Joshua chapter 21. If you have your Bibles, turn over there. Joshua chapter 21. And what we're going to do today is look at what God provided Israel, the land and the people in the land. Victory over those people, over the enemies. And then we're going to talk about the things that God has provided us, or at least one thing that God has promised to provide for us. And as we go through these points, we're going to look at a few words that come up through the book of Joshua. Before we start that, I want us to talk a little bit about Joshua 21 and everything that happens in between. If you remember the last sermon we did 2 weeks ago in this series, we were in Joshua 3 and 4, and now we're jumping all the way to the end of 21. What in the world happens in the book of Joshua in between all of that? Well, Jericho is taken around chapter 6, and then we have Ai not long after that, and they fail to take it, and then they're successful. And then from about chapters 9 through 12, it just says Israel's going out, conquering the land, defeating their enemies, and it talks about some of their victories in a very quick way. And then from chapters 12 onward, we have the land being divided up. If you're just studying through Joshua, we tend to skip over all of this stuff. We want to go, okay, the walls come tumbling down in Jericho, and then we go to chapter 24, as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. But all the stuff that's in between there is very important. And it shows how God delivers and provides for Israel what He said He was going to give to them. And in Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 through 45, we see the summary of what God has done for the people of Israel. Here's what it says. The first thing, God provides the land. This is verse 43. Read this with me, if you will. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that He swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. So here at the end of the tribes going to their homes, to the land that's been allotted to them, it says first, God provided the land for them. The land that He promised to give them, He delivered it to them. I want us to note a few words here. The first is possess. It says there that they took possession of this land. This word shows up in some way about 20 times throughout the book of Joshua. And what possession indicates to us is that they reached out and grabbed what belonged to them. It was theirs to take hold of and hold on to. The land was theirs. In fact, the land was theirs before they even stepped on it. We'll talk about that in a moment. Another word, it doesn't appear here, but it's the word inherit. And over that section that we skip in chapters 12 onward to about this point, that's where the word inherit comes up over and over again. That the people of Israel inherited the land. That this tribe inherited this part of the land. That the land was an inheritance of theirs. Because it belonged to their father, and their father gave it to them. I don't know if you remember when we talked about in chapter 1, verse 3. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. And when we talked about that in the first lesson, we noted this phrase. Every place where your foot will go, I have given it to you. Before they even step on the land, God says, this belongs to you. You're going to take possession of it. It's rightfully yours. It's your inheritance. But here's the third word I want us to see. The word give. Over and over again, about 82 times throughout the book, give or given or He gave is used throughout the book, and it shows that this is God's land to give away. 32 times it's used to talk about the land. God wants to give His people the land, and it's His to give away. And here it says in verse 43 that he swore, that he promised to give this to their fathers. And so they went up and they took hold of what was rightfully theirs. If we put all this together, God provided land to Israel by giving it to them as a possession and an inheritance. It's belonged to them. And when they're standing there in Joshua 1 and in Deuteronomy 1, they feel hopeless about the land. They feel hopeless about their enemies. How are we going to take this land away from them? You're not going to take it away from them. It's yours. You're going to have it handed back to you. It belongs to you. And so God provides them not just the land, but hope through the land by handing it over what is rightfully theirs. Here's the second. God provides rest. This is verse 44. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. There are a couple words I want us to note here. One of them does not appear here. It's the word melt. Doesn't show up here, but the idea of it is, not a single one of their enemies had withstood them. Now, it doesn't have the word melt in there, but just the 6 times that it's used throughout the book, it's used to talk about the enemies every single time. You've probably heard the phrase, they're more scared of you than you are of them. Okay, I know that it's summer, or getting close to summer, because I arrive to the office with a can of wasp spray every day. You can ask Tony about this. And my dad has said, and other people here have said, nicely, they're more scared of you than you are of them. I don't believe that to be true. That's why I have the wasp spray with me. But the people of Israel, as they're standing at the entrance of the Promised Land, they look at the giant cities and the giant people, and they are scared to death. And so in Deuteronomy 1, they say, we can't take it. 10 of the 12 say there's no way we're going to be able to take the land. And so they end up wandering the wilderness for 40 years. And in Joshua 1, they're still afraid, but they are going to be strong and courageous and take this land. As it turns out, the people in the land were more scared of Israel than Israel was of them. And in chapter 2, we read this from Rahab, a Gentile in the city of Jericho who's only heard of some of the things that the God of Israel has done. But I want you to notice what she says in chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the Amorite kings beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. Listen to this in verse 11. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Twice she uses the phrase melt here in this section. All the inhabitants of the land melt before you. And as soon as we heard it, as soon as we heard that the Red Sea was parted for you to leave Egypt and walk across on dry land, our hearts melted. And as soon as we heard about what you did to the Amorite kings just beyond the Jordan, our hearts melted. As soon as we knew you were coming to Jericho and that we were next, our hearts melted. Here's the funny thing about all that. Here at the end of verse 11, she says, why their hearts melted. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. In Deuteronomy 1, after having crossed the Red Sea, these people heard about that. They were there when this happened. They can't even seem to get this. And yet you have Rahab, who is sitting in the city of Jericho, a fortified city, tall walls. She's in the land of the giants. And she can recognize the God that is with you is one that should be feared, because he can do whatever he wants. Israel couldn't even get that. And that just goes to show what happens when there is something that seems hopeless before us. We can easily forget who God is. Rahab gets it right here. Your God is the God of the heavens above and the earth beneath. And as a result, the hearts of the people melt. Here's word number 2. A word we've already seen, the word give. 82 times throughout the book, and 16 of those times, or about 16 of those times, it's in regards to the people. I will give to you the inhabitants of the land. The people in the land are going to be given to you, Israel. And so not only are they going to take possession of the land, they're going to take possession of the people. Nobody is going to be able to stand before them. And we've said this a couple times already. The very thing that made them hopeless, according to Deuteronomy 1, giant cities, giant people. And we mean giants. Giants in the land. There's no way we can take them. In Joshua chapter 11, there are a few verses that are just kind of tucked away in there about their battles. But I want to read that to you because it holds for us something very important about those giants and what they did here in the land. Here's what we read. And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. So Joshua took the whole land, according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel, according to the tribal allotments, and the land had rest from war. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of Israel. That is one of the phrases, the word Anakim. The giants were called a few different names. That's one of them. So what this is saying is there was none of the giants left in the land, save for a few of the Philistine cities. But for the most part, it says Joshua devoted them to destruction. He chased them up into the hill country and wiped them out. The high ground is supposed to be the advantage. He went up in the hill country of Judah, the hill country of Israel. He wiped them all out, with the exception of a few. You know probably very well David and Goliath. When we get to David and Goliath, Goliath is an oddity. He's weird. He's one of the last few remaining giants according to the flow of Scripture. He's one of the last few. He's weird. When we're in Joshua, they're all over the place. Why is Goliath weird by the time we get to David and Goliath? Because Joshua and the people of Israel, who were scared to death of the giants and the giant cities in the land, the text says went and wiped out not only the giants, but their cities. That is the very thing that caused them to be hopeless, and they didn't stand a chance before God and before Israel. This is what happens when hopeless things show up in our life. We look at the hopeless thing and go, there's no way we can take that on. And they looked at the giants and they said, there's no way that we can handle these giants that are in front of us. They're too strong, they're too big, the cities are too great. There's no way we'll be able to take them on. And in Joshua 1, God says, be strong and courageous. I'm with you. I will overcome these giants. I'll give you the land, and I'll give you rest from your enemies. And He does exactly that. It makes us think about what does God do with our hopeless situations, with our giants that we look at and say, we can't take that on. God can defeat those too. So here we see the second thing God's provided Israel, the land and rest. And He provided rest to Israel by melting the hearts of their enemies and giving them into their hand. And then we have verse 45, God promised. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. Not one. Not a single thing that the Lord said, I'm going to do for you, failed. He made it happen. He delivered on all of it. All of it came to pass. Now, if I asked you a couple weeks ago and said, God here in the early part of the book is promising to Israel, I will wipe out the giants and I'll give you the land. I don't think anybody in here would have said, I don't know about that. Let's see if God does it or not. I don't know if He can do it. That wouldn't have happened. You would have said, no, if God says He's going to take out the giants, if He's going to give them the land, He's going to take out the giants and He's going to give them the land. I don't think there would have been anybody in here who would have doubted that for a second. You've read to the end of the book. You know how God works. We read all these other things about how God provides and does. And so you would have said, if God says He's going to do it, give them land and give them rest, then He is going to do it. Our problem is not with the text. Our problem is when we find ourselves standing before the giants, all of a sudden everything changes. God has always delivered for His people, but when it's us in the hopeless situation, all of a sudden, I don't know if God's going to help me with this. I don't know if God is going to be able to get me out of this situation. I don't know if God's going to be able to turn this hopeless thing into something I can move past. He did it for them. Not one of the good promises failed. All came to pass. The same thing is true for us. And in looking at that idea, I want to talk about what God provides us. These verses will be on the screen. A couple more words for us, but out of Hebrews. It's no mistake we're going to Hebrews chapter 4. Joshua is talked about there. In fact, the rest that Joshua provided is talked about in Hebrews chapter 4. But it's talked about in a different way. The rest that Joshua provides for Israel is good rest, but it's not the best rest that's possible. It's a precursor to something that God is going to do much later through His Son, Jesus Christ. That something He's going to do for the Christian much later on. And in Hebrews chapter 4, we're going to look at two words. The first here is rest. I want us to look at chapter 4, verses 8 through 9. Here's what it says on the screen here. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. God is not talking about, the Hebrew writer here is not talking about a Saturday rest. The Sabbath was their seventh day. God rested on the seventh day. They were rescued from Egypt, and so they rest as a reminder of those things. That was good and required then, but it's a precursor for something better for us. And that rest is, according to chapter 3, which we don't have time to look at this morning, the rest of heaven. That there is a great rest that awaits for the people of God, the rest that comes for all eternity, that we'll all go and get to someday. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. God has a rest planned out for us, but here's where it gets better. Chapter 4 and verse 1. It's a promise. Here's what it says. Therefore, while the promise of entering His rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. The rest that awaits the people of God is a promise. It's not some maybe it'll happen. It's not some, well, we'll wait and see if God can defeat these giants, if God can provide this rest, if God can provide the promised land for the Christian. There's no questioning it. The whole point of Joshua and Israel and the conquering of that promised land and the rest they received is to indicate to us that God always keeps His promises, and He promises to you and to me that there is a rest for His people still to come. Not one of His good promises failed. All came to pass. God provided then. He's going to provide in the future. And He's providing now. And in those times where you feel hopeless and you wonder, what is God going to do in my hopeless situation? God is there to provide. He always does. That doesn't mean that with heaven there in the destination that we're headed towards that spot, that it makes the hopeless thing that we're going through disappear. We still have to deal with the hopeless thing. But when you know that something better is awaiting your future, where there will be no more hopeless situations, where there will be no more pain or sorrow, where all of that will be done away with. Happiness for eternity. It can help make those times of hopelessness seem a little more hopeful. There was an older guy that came to one of the preacher training camps I attended as a camper several years ago. He left a big impression on everybody at the camp because weeks after we left camp, we were posting to Facebook and other places this phrase that he said. We were saying it to each other. He just had a huge impact on us. He had a great personality. He was high energy. He was a new convert that had a real fire for reaching out to people. He was a morning person, so I didn't like that part of him. But he was always happy and excited and going. And whenever you asked him, "How are you doing today?" he would always excitedly say, "I'm doing great. I'm one day closer to heaven." Every time. And it didn't matter who you were. When he was out in public, going somewhere, he's at a restaurant, he's at the grocery store, and somebody says, "Hey, how are you doing?" he would always say, "I'm doing great. I'm one day closer to heaven. I'm one day closer to the promise. I'm one day closer to spending eternity with the God that I love and that loves me very much. I'm one day closer to leaving behind sorrow and things that hurt for all eternity." I don't know what happened in his life. I don't know what pain he had to deal with, what loss he had to deal with, what hopeless situations he may have found himself in, but I do know this, that he was a hope-filled man, because he knew that heaven and the promise of heaven and that rest was in his future. I want to challenge you to do this week. And I'm going to try through Facebook and some other ways to help remind you so that we don't forget to do this. But I want to encourage you to do this. When you wake up tomorrow, whether it be by yourself or with your family or to your spouse or to whoever, remind yourself, "I'm one day closer to heaven." It doesn't make the hopeless situation go away, but it does help us to see that there is something better for sure. A promise on the horizon that we are headed somewhere where we will never have to deal with hopelessness ever again. And that can make the hopeless situation even just a little bit easier to handle. This morning you might be somebody who, even though we have a promised rest, you're tired now. You're exhausted now. You're at the end now. We want to pray with you. We want to help you through that, not just with prayer, but in providing what it is that you need as God's hand to provide for you what you need to keep going on. Some of you in here, whether I know it or not, you feel hopeless. You feel like you've got no way out of the situation you're in. You've got heaven and the promise of that rest in front of you. And you've got people here who love and care about you that want to help you through that. So whether it's by coming up here and asking for prayers, meeting one of us in the back, or asking for the elders to pray for you tonight, we want to help you. We want to pray with you. We want to help you have the hope that you should have as the people of God who have a promised rest waiting for you.
Standing on the promises of Christ my King, through eternal ages.